November 19, 1944. The intelligence section of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, operating in the Alsace corridor south of Sarrebourg, France, received a field report that Obersturmführer Klaus Riedel marked with a question he could not answer. The report described a single American soldier, a black soldier, private rank, no officer present, who had advanced alone on a fortified farmhouse position, engaged 2 German machine gun crews in sequence, and held the position for 40 minutes until his unit could consolidate. Alone. Private rank. No officer directing him. Riedel's training said this was not how American Negro troops behaved. They required close supervision. They operated only under direct white officer command. Without that structure, German doctrine held, the individual fighting effectiveness of black American soldiers collapsed to near zero. This was not inference. This was written into the 17th SS's intelligence briefings as established fact, sourced from 3 years of assessments that had arrived from Army Group G headquarters with the confidence of men who had never once tested the assumption. Riedel read the report twice. He filed it under unbestit, unconfirmed. Not because the observation was ambiguous, because if it was confirmed, it meant something about the war he was fighting that he was not yet ready to write down. The German belief that black American soldiers required white officer supervision to function in combat was not a casual prejudice. It had been constructed into a formal operational doctrine by late 1943, assembled from multiple intelligence sources that reinforced each other in ways that made the conclusion feel empirical. German observers of the 92nd Infantry Division's early performance in Italy had noted inconsistencies in unit cohesion when officer casualties removed immediate command structure. German analysts had read American military sociologists whose pre-war writings discussed the effects of segregation on minority troop motivation in terms that German doctrine converted, with selective precision, into a prediction about battlefield reliability. And German interrogators of captured black American soldiers had reported, in assessments filed with Army Group G, that many prisoners expressed ambivalence about the war they were fighting, not enough to constitute disloyalty, but enough to confirm, in the German framework, that their commitment was conditional and officer-dependent. The assessment was not entirely fabricated. It contained real observations twisted to a false conclusion. The inconsistencies in 92nd Division performance were real and were produced by a specific American policy of assigning the least experienced white officers to black units, which meant that when officers fell, the organizational scaffolding that compensated for poor leadership fell with it. The ambivalence in prisoner testimony was real, the product of fighting for a country that was still openly debating whether you were worth fighting for. The German error was in the direction of causation. They had observed symptoms of institutional failure and attributed them to racial inadequacy. They had built an entire combat doctrine on that attribution. Obersturmführer Riedel was about to watch it break. He just did not know yet what was doing the breaking, or what it would cost. The soldier in Riedel's report was Private First Class Rupert Tibbs of the 604 4th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 103rd Infantry Division in the Vosges Mountains sector of eastern France. Tibbs was 22 years old, from Louisville, Kentucky, and had been in continuous contact with German forward positions for 11 days when the farmhouse engagement occurred on November 17, 1944. The farmhouse sat at a road junction controlling the approach to the village of Barenthal, and its capture had been a tactical objective for 36 hours before Tibbs's platoon reached it. 2 previous attempts by the leading infantry company had been stopped by the machine gun positions in the farmhouse's upper story and a connected barn. The positions were mutually supporting, engaging one drew fire from the other, and the approach route offered less than 30 meters of covered ground before the final open sprint to the farmhouse wall. What happened next was not ordered. Tibbs's platoon leader, a white second lieutenant named Gerald Marsh, had gone forward to observe the position and had been wounded by shrapnel from a German mortar round at approximately 0740 hours, leaving the platoon without commissioned officer command. The platoon sergeant, a black staff sergeant named Elmore Washington, had consolidated the men in cover and was assessing the situation when Tibbs, without orders, without discussion, and without apparent hesitation, moved. He crossed the open ground in what Washington later estimated was 11 seconds. He reached the farmhouse wall. He moved along it to the barn entrance. What happened in the barn, and then in the farmhouse, over the next 40 minutes, produced 3 separate accounts from American witnesses and 2 from German survivors, and all 5 of them agreed on the outcome. The position fell. Tibbs walked out. The road junction was open by 0900 hours. What they disagreed on, violently, institutionally, and with consequences that reached all the way to Patton's headquarters, was who deserved the credit. Lieutenant Gerald Marsh, evacuated to a field hospital with shrapnel wounds to his left arm and shoulder, filed his after-action report from the hospital on November 19, 1944. The report described the capture of the Barenthal farmhouse junction. It described the tactical situation, the 2 previous failed attempts, and the German defensive positions in accurate detail. It then described, in the passive institutional language of a man constructing a narrative around an uncomfortable center, how elements of the platoon had successfully assaulted the position following his own preliminary observation and assessment, which had established the conditions for the successful advance. The report did not name Rupert Tibbs. It attributed the outcome to collective platoon action, shaped by Marsh's preparatory leadership, in terms that a reader of the report would interpret as the lieutenant having set the stage for a coordinated assault that unfolded after his evacuation. It was, in the careful way of official documents that allied rather than lie, a claim. Not a fabrication, but an appropriation. The absorption of another man's individual action into a collective outcome attributed to the absent officer's prior intent. Sergeant Washington's report, filed the same day through the same chain of command, named Tibbs directly and described what had actually occurred with the unambiguous precision of a man who had watched it happen from 15 meters away and understood exactly what he was seeing. The 2 reports arrived at the 103rd Infantry Division's G1 section simultaneously. The G1 officer, a major, had to decide which account to forward to higher headquarters as the basis for any commendation action. He forwarded Marsh's. Washington's was filed. Correctly, completely, and without consequence. This is where the story becomes something other than a personnel dispute, because Washington's report did not stay filed. It moved through the informal networks that connected black soldiers across the American military, through the chaplain's office of the 6th Fort 4th, through a letter that Washington wrote to the battalion's executive officer describing what had happened, until it reached Lieutenant Colonel James Barfoot, the 6th Fort 4th's commanding officer, who had it on his desk by November 22nd. Barfoot forwarded it to 3rd Army Headquarters with a cover letter requesting review. The request landed in Patton's daily briefing on November 24th, 1944. And then something happened that nobody in the chain had predicted, because nobody in the chain had accurately modeled what Patton would do when presented with evidence that a white officer had placed his name over a black soldier's action. Patton did not send the matter back down the chain. He did not schedule a review board. He did not allow the institutional momentum of Marsh's already filed report to carry the outcome to its natural destination. He drove to the 103rd Infantry Division's headquarters that same afternoon, reviewed both reports in the presence of the division commander, and issued a correction order that substituted Washington's account for Marsh's as the basis of record, named Tibbs individually, and initiated commendation proceedings for both Tibbs and Washington. One for the action, one for the accuracy. He then had a brief conversation with the G1 major, whose routing decision had nearly buried the correct account. Codman's diary describes Patton's tone in this conversation as quiet, which in my experience is considerably more alarming than loud. What the Germans watching the Barenthal sector observed in the days following November 17th was a pattern shift they could not explain with their existing assessment framework. It was not the fall of the farmhouse junction, positions fell. That was the nature of the campaign. It was what happened in the 72 hours that followed, as word of the Tibbs incident spread through the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion and then outward through the black units operating in the 103rd Division sector. Not as official communication, but as the kind of story that travels when it says something people have been waiting to hear confirmed. Raidel's updated intelligence assessment, filed December 1, 1944, noted what he described as a marked increase in individual initiative among colored American troops in the sector beginning approximately November 20th. He documented 4 specific engagements between November 20th and November 30th, in which Black American soldiers had operated effectively at the individual and small unit level without apparent officer direction, exactly the behavior his previous framework had classified as impossible. He was a careful analyst, and he did not overstate his conclusions. But he added a notation to his assessment that his section chief underlined in the copy that reached Army Group G, Unse Annahmen Berdies Einheiten sind möglicherweise falsch. Our assumptions about these units may be wrong. It was the most cautious possible formulation. It was also the first time that formulation had appeared in a 17th SS intelligence document concerning Black American troops. It had taken 1 private from Louisville, 11 seconds of open ground, 40 minutes in a farmhouse, and 1 general who drove 40 kilometers to make sure the right name was on the right report. Obersturmführer Raidel was captured by American forces on March 3, 1945, near Wissembourg. During his initial interrogation, he asked his American interrogator which units had been operating in the Barenthal sector the previous November. The interrogator told him. Raidel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought so." He did not elaborate. His interrogator's report noted the exchange without explanation because the interrogator did not know the context. The context was that Raidel had spent 3 months watching his assumptions dissolve 1 engagement at a time, and he had just learned the name of the unit responsible for starting the process. By February 1945, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion had earned a unit reputation in the 7th Army's sector that German commanders noted explicitly in their operational planning, designating its known positions as primary threat vectors in their defensive adjustments, a distinction typically reserved for elite formations. The battalion that German doctrine had categorized as supervision-dependent had forced its way onto the German threat list on its own merits, 1 action at a time, beginning with 11 seconds of open ground on a November morning. The formal record of what followed Patton's November 24th intervention is specific. Private First Class Rupert Tibbs received the Silver Star for his actions at Barenthal Farmhouse Junction on November 17, 1944. Staff Sergeant Elmore Washington received a Bronze Star for his accurate field reporting under conditions where the institutional incentive ran entirely in the opposite direction. Lieutenant Gerald Marsh's after-action report was corrected in the official record. Marsh was not court-martialed and was not formally disciplined. Patton's intervention had been surgical enough to correct the record without generating an institutional crisis around the correction. This was deliberate. Patton understood that a court-martial proceeding would have made the dispute the story, obscuring the action that had produced it. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion's combat record for the period November 1944 through May 1945 is documented in the National Archives with the specificity that the Army's Historical Division applied to units it subsequently recognized as significant. The battalion destroyed 42 enemy armored vehicles, neutralized 63 artillery pieces, and in 1 engagement on January 14, 1945, near Kleimbach, France, fighting the same 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division that Raidel had served, repelled a German counterattack against an exposed flank position, holding for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived at a cost of 11 killed and 23 wounded. The battalion received the Distinguished Unit Citation. The commendation, like so many issued to black units in this war, arrived after the kind of institutional delay that had become its own form of comment. It was formally presented in 1996. Raidel's post-captivity memoir, completed in 1962 and archived by the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, contains a chapter on what he called the Barenthal error, his section's failure to correctly assess the combat potential of Black American soldiers in the autumn of 1944. His conclusion, written 17 years after the events it described, was precise. We had confused the limitations of the institution that trained these men with the limitations of the men themselves. They were not the same limitations. They were not even similar ones. Here is the counterintuitive truth that Rydell's intelligence framework was not built to hold. The performance of people within a flawed institution is not a reliable measure of what those people are capable of. It is a measure of what the institution permits, incentivizes, and attributes. Rupert Tibbs crossed 30 meters of open ground on his own initiative, held a position for 40 minutes, and changed the tactical situation at a road junction in eastern France. None of that required the institution's permission. What the institution then did with the fact of it, file it under the wrong name, route it away from consequence, absorb it into an absent officer's narrative, was a separate act, by separate people, that had nothing to do with what had actually happened at 074 hours on November 17th. Patton understood the difference between these two things with the clarity of a man who had spent 3 decades watching institutions misattribute outcomes. He drove 40 kilometers to correct one misattribution, not because it was administratively tidy, but because he understood that the attribution of credit is not a bureaucratic question. It is an operational one. Soldiers who know their actions will be correctly recorded, perform differently than soldiers who know their actions will be absorbed into someone else's account. The difference is not sentiment, it is arithmetic. The German doctrine that black soldiers required white officer supervision to function had built this error into its foundational assumption. It had confused dependent performance with inherent capability. The supervision was not producing the performance. The supervision, in many cases, was limiting it. Because a man performing under close supervision performs within the boundaries the supervisor can see, and Rupert Tibbs's boundaries, on that November morning, extended considerably further than any officer present could have ordered him to go. He went there anyway. What Patton ensured was that the record showed he had gone there himself. Credit belongs to the person who earned it. This is not a moral principle, it is a management one. Institutions that systematically misattribute outcomes to the wrong people eventually lose the capacity to produce those outcomes at all. The right name on the right report. Every time. Without exception.